Thank you, Sanjay, for agreeing to be a part of this interview. And could you please tell us about, give us an insight into Paraxel's core services?
Yeah, absolutely. So Parexel is one of the leading clinical research organizations into biopharmaceutical services. So technically, everything to do from conducting a study from early phase to phase 2, 3P to late phase, taking the molecule right from the first phase of the study to the last phase and then taking it ultimately to the market is exactly what Parexel is engaged into. Now, there are two main divisions that define this core services under Parexel. So one is the clinical development organization that comprises of the core clinical research conduct piece of it. So the entire study conduct is managed by this. And then you have the regulatory and consulting division that technically helps you with all sorts of regulatory consultancy that you might require, right from your clinical trial applications to dossiers to everything that you need to know from a regulations perspective and do the right things to get that molecule into the market, pre and post clinical, both commercial as well as clinical both. So that's probably I would define the core services of Parexel. So we approximately have around 15,000 plus people globally operating in more than 120 plus locations, and India being one of the prominent ones out there.
So could you give us an overview on Paraxel's activities in India?
Absolutely. So Parexel in India probably came into operations around 15 to 20 years ago. It started with a very small set of people, with just 20 to 25 people. Today, we are almost a 5,000 plus organization. So technically, if I have to put the Parexel India organization, every single department within the Parexel world, is today technically present in India. So there are 18 plus clinical functions that operate out of India that support the global, local, and regional study conduct. So I'll give you an example. So we have services, global safety services, pharmacovigilance, global data organization, medical writing, data management, stats programming, biostatisticians, everything that's needed for project management to clinical operations, clinical monitors, clinical supplies and logistics team members. So, and plus, while we have this set of business functions that are supporting the global and local study conduct, we also have the shared services center out here for finance and HR as well. So that comprises around 10%, 10 to 15% of the population. But today, out of the 5,000, as I said, you can literally call it like a mini CRO in India with 5,000. We represent 25% of Parexel's global population. So that's the size of India today.
What's the positioning when it comes to India in the global clinical trial maps, and how do you see this evolving for you, and how do you see India's potential to becoming a clinical trial hub?
I'll try and give you some statistics around it and the reason why India is becoming a prominent player. So the couple of things that has happened in India over a period of time now, fortunately, there was a time somewhere between 2000 and 2013 when India was actually a pretty strong clinical hub, but due to some regulatory challenges and compliance challenges, many of the study conduct started moving out, and the regulations became so stringent that it was becoming very impossible to conduct studies. Fortunately, the new regulations this were issued by DCGI in 2019 has brought in a new phase of clinical trial conduct in India. So that's just one part of it. But if you really look from just an industry perspective, why we are continuing to invest in India, right? Why do I think India is a potential area? Because one is almost like if you really look at the India pharmaceutical market, it's a third largest by volume globally, right? If you really look, like they call it as the world's pharmaceutical hub from that perspective. But having said that, it's growing at a 7 to 8% CAGR on an ongoing basis. Now, obviously, a lot of that growth is happening on the generics segment, but there are a lot of biopharmaceutical companies that are popping up who are now investing in new molecules that could be brought up into the market across multiple therapies. So that's one part of it. It's amongst the top 12 biotech destinations in the world for investment, for talent, for knowledge perspective. So that makes it again pretty attractive for the pharmaceutical industry and for the research industry to come in. Also, it's the second highest in terms of the number of US FDA approvals that we've got from a plant's perspective, the manufacturing perspective, right? So definitely the environment, the ecosystem is pretty conducive and is well prepared to set this up. But having said that, the 1.2 billion population in India, with the amount of disease burden that sits here across the wide population, also makes it a very strong value proposition for pharmaceutical companies to start looking at India as a potential destination to bring new therapies into the market so that the patients can get benefited out of it, right? So there are a multitude of those facets. And if I have to come from a talent perspective, the last angle, which is the people, we almost have more than 230,000 pharmacy graduates that come out every year, like the doctors, physicians. So it's definitely a good pool of people. Like when I talk about statistical programmers, biostatisticians, we're talking about technical expertise, medical writers, where we need physicians to do this, pharmacovigilance, safety services piece of it. India is becoming really a strong hub from that perspective. That's why I think why we have continued to grow at a double digit in India for par excel, which is why from 50 to 5,000 is the growth journey that we have had in a span of less than 15 years. So I hope that summarizes. Is that what you're looking out for? So
Yeah, you
yeah.
partly answered my next question also. So, so nevertheless, I will ask the same. What are some of the key growth areas that will have an impact on various areas of clinical trials or clinical research in India?
Yeah. So I'll just touch base a few of them, maybe since this is a very specific question on that. So one is because now that the clinical trial regulations have improved to a very large extent, the DCGI, if you really look at the number of global clinical trial applications that has been approved, if you look at 2013 and 2019, the growth has been almost 55% plus. Now, the percentage wise, it looks bigger because the number of applications were like, we are talking about going from anywhere between 95 applications to 180 plus applications in a span of 7 to 8 years, right? So I do definitely see that a lot of global enterprise pharmaceutical organizations who are looking out to bring new therapies into the market are looking out for patient populations like India, like China, like many other countries where they can try and get those therapies that could ultimately benefit the patient. So the population patient burden definitely helps. So the conduct of clinical trials, I believe more and more multinationals will start looking at India because of this ease of regulations. The second thing that has happened is the clinical trial approval timelines. Previously, it would take anywhere between 6 to 8 months before a CTA or a clinical trial application could be approved. We are talking about with these new regulations, many of those applications are approved in 30 to 90 days. What they're saying is they have improved the regulations to a large extent where they're saying that if you don't receive a response from a DCGI within the particular set of time, you get a deemed approval. And that's the kind of flexibility that DCGI today is giving to both the Indian biotech as well as the multinational biotech companies to come in. The other piece is the post-trial access rules have now been very clearly established because I think with all the challenges that happened in 2013 with the compliance issues where the e-consent forms were signed without informing the patient what they're signing up for and all that stuff. I think all those loopholes the government has now filled in with very stringent regulations around post-trial access, making sure that the patients continue to get the medication even if the company decides not to launch the product. Right in the market, the product might be successful, but making those medications available to the patients, those regulations have improved. So I do see a growth in that parameter as well. There is a stringent oversight. We are talking about electronic submissions now to the DCGI portal, so which is also becoming a little bit easier. Previously, there was a very strict mandate that you need to have minimum 50 beds, or you can only do 3 studies per investigator sites. All those restrictions now have gone off. Plus, at the same time, the requirement of having an ethics committee within 50 kilometers radius of the investigator site has also become mandated. So the last but not the least, but if you've heard recently with this COVID situation, but COVID is just one of the trigger points. But before COVID also, they've gone ahead and increased the validity of the import license also from 1 year to 3 years. So that allows a lot of that IP drug to come into the market. So if you've got the import license today, you can still have another 3 years for you to get the drug and start the testing. So all this has become conducive. Ultimately, what it leads is, I believe that I'm not saying that it's going to be like a steep growth like this. It will be a slope growth that will happen, but I'm sure that India prominently has a very strong capability to go back to what it was 7 years or 8 years back from a clinical. It was a leading country from a clinical trial conduct perspective at some point of time, but after those disasters, much of that studies went to Australia, China, and many other countries as well. So I believe that potential to come back, and ultimately the patients are going to get benefited because the more therapies you have, the more options you get for treatments, right? You're not only dependent on the core treatment that's available to you. Having said that, that means from a clinical research perspective, we do have a potential growth opportunities in the area of recruiting more medical writers, more data management, more stats programming team, more physicians on board, clinical operations, expanding the clinical operations team, the clinical monitors who need to visit to the sites as well. So the opportunity of growth spans across all of them. So while they continue to support the global studies, they can also add on now supporting the local studies as well.
So you're saying that now the regulatory framework and the environment in India is comparable to the global one?
I would say to a very large extent, to the extent that even the clinical trial application fee is now at par at applying a clinical trial application if you're applying in US or in Europe. Now, people were skeptical that it was cheaper to get a clinical trial application submitted in India, right? But the reason why they did that is because I think this was to arrest a lot of this non-compliance conduct that was taking place by many of the small local players who did not understand the importance of the GCP and the GMP compliance piece of it, right? The good clinical practices. I think by increasing the standards of right from the clinical trial application fees to the regulations piece of it, I think we are at par at some of the US FDA, CFDA, China FDA did the same changes 3 years back, which is where they were able to take advantage of much of the. So I believe, yes, I'm pretty optimistic that with these changes, and it was interesting because Dr. Somani had attended our India symposium. We had an India symposium last year where we had invited a lot of customers, and he came as a keynote speaker. And one of the things I still remember very adamantly, and I met him 2 or 3 times already, and very impressed with the gentleman, because every time you go to Dr. Thumani and you say that this is the challenge, and he says, okay, where is the challenge? Show me what is it that we can do to help you. There were questions that were asked in terms of, okay, can we do decentralized trials, direct to patient trials? Can we take the trials to patients' home, right? And he says, does the regulation stop you? And the answer, the audience was like, no, it doesn't. So then what is stopping you then? Like, why are you not then initiating processes? If you have hurdles, we are here to help it out. So I believe that India is definitely on the phase of that scenario where they are open, welcoming in terms of evaluating new technologies, new avenues, new alternate strategies to clinical trials, while focusing to grow the core clinical growth as well.
So you spoke about the Eclinical technologies that are there. So what are your views on that?
It's interesting, um, and I laugh at this, Sujata, because every time. So I'll give you a great example, right? So we've been talking about decentralized trials and the opportunity for us to take the trials to the patient's home for 7 years now, 5 to 7 years. The biggest challenge for conducting a clinical trial, there are two things that impact the clinical trial conduct. One is the patient recruitment strategy, because 60% of the time patients drop off in the middle of the study, and that is what leads to, like, the extra efforts that you have to go in. So how do you continue to educate the patients and get them onboarded so that the whole clinical trial conduct process can happen? But at the same time, how do you make life easier for the investigator sites, for the patients, to get to be a part of the study? Because traditionally, I don't know how much you are well versed, Sujata, but if ever I sit back and start talking to about clinical trials to my family, for them it's like, what are you talking about? People know about generics. Well, now clinical trials have come on the forefront because of pandemic, where suddenly everybody knows now what clinical trials are. But a year back, if you would have sat back with somebody and spoken about clinical trials, they wouldn't know what does that. And clinical trial was looked upon always as the last option as therapy if everything else fails, right? In order to address this, I think the technology going forward is going to play a very, very strong role. And I'm sorry I was giving you this background because it's important to understand what role technology will play. So if you look at DCT or decentralized trials, 5 years back, this was looked upon as an alternate strategy. Agar ye nahi hua, to we will think about decentralized trial. It was like today, it has become a mitigation strategy for the pandemic. The pandemic forced a lot of the sponsors, regulators, to accept that today we were forced to take the clinical trial to the patient's home. We were forced to deliver the drugs to patients' home because the patients couldn't visit the investigator sites because of the fear of COVID. Most of the investigator sites around the world were busy treating the COVID patients, right? For them, the priority suddenly dropped to now. That is also dangerous because there are still patients on oncology, hematology. There are many other diseases that they were going through. You couldn't have dropped those patients from getting those medications, right? Because if you drop the cycle, the entire efficacy goes for a toss, right? The entire study, and the patient's life is at jeopardy, right? So I think because of decentralized trial, it is suddenly that alternative strategy has become a mitigation strategy. And with decentralized trials, things like telemedicine, like we are able to now, we implemented technologies like remote data monitoring. Our clinical monitors, instead of going to the sites, because you have to physically go to do the clinical monitoring piece of it, we were able to do this both with the patient and by implementing technologies, which is app-based video calling and other stuff. We were able to consult with the doctor and with the patient simultaneously and yet record the information. Now, of course, the amount of information collected started piling up because you're talking about relying on data, resources of data like electronic health records. EHR became suddenly an important part. Previously, EHR was not given an importance because like it was just a formality, fill up ABC information, just drop it out, right? But now, because of the decentralized trials, these are our core sources of reliance, right? So electronic health records, telemedicine piece of it, taking and shipping the drugs from the investigator site directly to the patient's home, so that and monitoring the patients at home, sending the doctors or nurses at the patient's home to see if they are taking their medications properly. So this is one of the examples of impact that has happened from a technology perspective that has driven us from a centralized monitoring to a remote monitoring concept. And technology has played a bigger role in that. The second aspect is the data, because everything in the clinical world is about data, because if you have the right data, only then you can do the right analysis, and that's when you get the therapy into the market. You cannot afford to have a wrong data because you're dealing with people's life, right? So our ability to collect that data in a centralized cloud format, in a secured form, and then further analyze and use that data towards making sure that is this the right therapy that could be launched into the market has also started playing a major role. This is where artificial intelligence has started playing a major role from that perspective. Like, how is it that you can use, and this links into the real world evidence also. So for example, because now everybody is trying to get the therapies into the market faster. Vaccines is a great example. Normally, it would take anywhere between 3 years to 5 years to 7 years for a product to fully go through the whole life cycle of a testing and come into the market. Vaccines have been amazing in the last 18 months, right? Parexel personally have been involved in 250 plus COVID studies, including vaccines and all that stuff. We've been able to conduct these studies in a matter of 3 to 6 months' time. We have had situations where we have been dealing with certain COVID therapies where we have used the support of real world evidence and real world data. So what I'm saying is at this point of time, Parexel has been at the forefront of using the real world data and real world evidence to accelerate the information, improve the efficiency of conducting the clinical trial. So we are just not relying on the clinical data, but in the real world, how is the drug acting on a patient, so that you don't have to, and we introduced a concept called synthetic control arm. So rather than having a control arm, because normally you have a controlled arm within a clinical study conduct, right? Some people get placebo, some people get, so you don't know who's getting what. And that's why some people get skepticism. Like, like, why should I participate if I'm going to get water or placebo? And that's a worry, right? But this is where the synthetic control arm plays a major role. So you're trying to compare, so you no longer have to take the placebo piece of it. You do the clinical conduct and then you take the real world evidence and with a synthetic control arm, and then use both this data, use that real world evidence, translate it into a real world data that ultimately can help you validate the whole therapy, and is it really something that you can bring into the market more effectively. So this combination of using the clinical world data and the real world evidence is another area of technology that is really something that Parexel has invested in and has been coming in the forefront. We recently had some 2 or 3 good successes using the synthetic control arm of getting the therapies faster into the market. So these are some of the few examples from a technology perspective. I can talk the whole day, honestly speaking, Sujata. There are so many things that we can speak
Yeah,
about.
it's really interesting. I would want to discuss that further with you, maybe some other time, not during this interview, but I'll definitely write to you on that because it's a very interesting one.
Absolutely.
So moving on to the next question. So we have been called as the world's pharmacy, and now we are moving on to the biopharmaceuticals. Many people don't understand the difference between the normal pharmaceuticals and the biopharmaceuticals thing. So how do you see Parexel in this race?
Yeah. So good question. So because and you aptly said one is the biopharmaceutical piece is really taking a big plunge, positive plunge in the direction. I was just looking at some of the Jeffries report also today. If you look from a venture capitalist perspective as well as from an investment perspective, majority of the investment that's happening is into the new biotech sector as compared to thing. The other piece, Sujata, is also the therapies. Now, pandemic is one of the things. So, immuno-oncology has suddenly become a big talk of the topic, right? Anything related to pandemic, vaccines, and all that stuff has becoming popular. So, this is itself fueling the whole biotech growth from that perspective. In 2019, 2020 alone, if you see 20% of the clinical trials that were conducted were all with biologicals. It was interesting how this number is suddenly now starting to grow. People are looking at very specialized medications or target-based medications, precision medicines, which is why the biologicals are coming up. So tomorrow, I won't be surprised, Sujata, that we are sitting here 5 years down the lane and there will be targeted therapies that will be developed that the same molecule might work differently on your DNA versus might work differently on my DNA, right? So we're talking about those, and that's where the whole fueling of the biologicals has come up. India is definitely on the forefront. As I said, a lot of good, positive Indian biopharmaceutical companies are looking forward to now make investments in developing their own molecules, which I said earlier as well. But globally, also, I've seen this trend, which is an upward to double-digit growth year on year for the past 3 years. I'm seeing that's happening on the biological world. Now, what is Parexel doing about this, right? Since you asked the question, 2 years ago, we saw this trend happening, and what we did was we actually carved out and created a special biotech division within Parexel. So we have a division that focuses on our enterprise customers who are focusing on the big pharma and all that stuff. But today, we have a specialized division carved out with people, resources, subject matter expertise that has been carved out that's purely focuses only on the biotech segments. Now, you would be wondering, why do we need to do that? It's because of the agility and the mindset of biotech is very different. So we are talking about companies who are like four people companies who come together, develop a molecule, and then the acceleration with which they need to launch it into the market and take it to a level where probably they might be then bought over by somebody else. The pressures are very high, the budget pressures, the cost pressures, the pressure to get the molecule into the market. And in order to cater that, you needed a completely different mindset, a very agile mindset from an operations delivery perspective, a very agile mindset from a subject matter expertise perspective, right? Because the biologicals are very niche areas of expertise. So you needed therapeutic expertise who understands the biological space in terms of the disease therapies as well. So that's why we created this biotech division, which today has its own branding. If you go on the Parexel's website, you'll see there's a dedicated team that has been led by we have a dedicated leader as an SPU head leading the biotech division globally as well, both from a commercial and operations perspective. And that's what we are doing. So we are already in the what you call a little bit ahead of the game in terms of putting this focus. And this has really tremendously helped us because this division has been growing for us from a study conduct perspective, and especially with COVID, at almost 35 to 40% actually year on year. And that's the kind of pressure that we are dealing with. So our ability to bring in a flexible model to cater to these biotech customers has helped us because of this division. So that's what we're trying to do, both from a talent, resource, investment, and organization delivery perspective as well.
We are talking about a lot of technology over here. Use of AI, ML, blockchain, all these technologies are playing a big role in the global drug development, drug discovery, and the clinical research part. So we see a lot of adoption of these technologies. For example, the Moderna vaccine, which was made possible because of this technology. So how do we see India catching up with this kind of technologies? You know, the adoption rate. How do you rate that?
I would say it's still a little bit of a longer way to go from an India perspective. There are two reasons for that, Sujata. One is, even though the environment is fantastic, and in fact, many of those technologies, believe it or not, are actually developed in this part of the world, but they've been implemented somewhere else, right? You have a lot of strong technology incubators that are today present in India who are prepared to work with you, and develop those kind of set. The challenge is one is the overall study conduct environment, the number of study or the clinical trials that are currently being done in Europe and US are way much higher than compared to what is happening. Like I'm talking about 180 studies that are happening at this point of time, right? Which is still a long way to go. So the second piece is also the challenges, the geographical limitations in the infrastructure as well. So Tier 1 cities, great. If you're trying to target and work with the clinical study conduct in Tier 1 cities where you're dealing with a fairly more educated population, where you're able to sit back and explain them how a clinical studies conduct is much, much more easier. When you start going and taking those therapies to Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, the infrastructure is not there yet up to the mark in terms of the conduct of a clinical trial the way you want it, right? So, for example, we spoke about the decentralized trials, right? The whole idea of taking the clinical trial to a patient's home. It's still in bits and pieces has been implemented. So we had a situation where it was a diabetic drug. Of course, I can't indulge into too many details, but it was a diabetic drug that we have been working with an investigator site. And to the extent that because of the pandemic wave one, the patients couldn't come home. So we found an alternative way of monitoring those patients remotely, as I said, using technology, but at the same time, we're able to deliver some of those medications back to the patient's home much effective. Now, these patients were within the city limitations was much easier. What if this was like a tier 2, tier 3 city, but at the same time, how would you have done a remote monitoring using a video application? Now, the good part is India today is still the second largest mobile user in the world, and it's growing. So I would say that it is at the first beginning phase of it, as compared to the other part of the world as well. But it will get there. Real world evidence is another great example, right? We spoke about real world data, real world evidence. Electronic health records. If you go back to US or Europe, the EHRs are very, very strong. Like when you get some data from the EHR, it's very comprehensive with the notes and everything. But if you try to tap on some of the EHR data, first of all, disparate systems, right? None of the systems are talking to each other. You go to multitude hospitals, multiple doctors, everybody is running on their own disparate platform. There is no way unless somebody from, so I think with what the government is trying to do, like, and I think Arogya Setu and some of these are great examples what Niti Aayog is also trying to do, right? Trying to create a digital platform. I think there was an initiative that Mr. Modi announced a couple of months ago, where they talked about creating an e-health platform where the data of all citizens in India would be tracked and recorded, right? We still have to reach that stage. We're talking about 1.2 billion people population to be recorded. But imagine a situation if you're able to do that tomorrow. If that happens tomorrow, and if you have the right health records of the people, and if the people are allowed to make that decision as to what amount of data they can share and they want to share with the clinical trial providers, it would be so much easier for many of these drug developers or these innovators to then start identifying the right target population. The amount of time that's invested today to identify the population through the investigator sites itself takes a lot of time, right? But if the technology is implemented rightly, and if this platform gets available, if this kind of data gets available, then it will be. So I would say it's still in the beginning phases, still a long way to go, but I think those are some of the examples that I can see at this point of time. So the adoption of real world evidence, decentralized trials starting to happen, but it's still not there yet.
In a way, COVID and the pandemic has opened up many flaws in the system, but as well as the capabilities that are there, from inventing the vaccines to telemedicine, telehealth, everything has come up into the fore. So where does Parexel stand, and what are the steps that you have taken in terms of battling the COVID? What are the steps that, if there is another pandemic which is coming in, are we prepared for that?
I think the interesting part is, as I said, when the pandemic hit, the most interesting part happened was the change in the mindset of the regulators around the world, not just in India, because everything that the regulators thought was an alternate strategy, or no, this cannot be done because we need proper documentation, we need proper this, we need this, that. I think the flexibility that many of the MHRAs that have shown to adapt, to go from, like I said, from conducting a traditional clinical trial to adopting technologies and allowing to conduct a trials at patients' home, or doing remote monitoring, or data monitoring piece of it, relying on multitude of data to come to the conclusion. That itself is was the positive piece of it. I would say it has its challenges, no doubt about it. But what was important was to change that mindset. It literally has created a new hashtag in the clinical world called #NoLookingBack. And the reason reason why is because it has really given an avenue to the drug developers and the innovators and the clinical research organizations to really now push this agenda to the next level. And everybody's saying that, okay, now that we have started, let's not look back. Let's take this to the next level. The reason why we have been able to get vaccines so faster into the market, because we have been engaged in therapies where the MHRAs and the regulators have supported us in doing that, right? Of course, you have to be very careful. You have to make sure that everything from a compliance perspective, ethical code of conduct perspective has been taken care because you're dealing with patients' life. And that's what Parexel has been doing. So Parexel, while we were working on 250 plus COVID therapies and vaccines, we were ensuring that we were nowhere compromising on the compliance piece of it. I think that was the most critical component as an organization that we followed. So no compromise on the compliance, but yet achieve the targeted results that our sponsors were looking out for, work with the regulators, find alternative avenues, and make sure. I'll give you a great example. So in Europe, you require a qualified personnel to do a QP audit, a physical GMP audit of the facility. Now, because of the lockdowns, many of our QPs were not able to travel. The manufacturing units were based in India, in China, in Indonesia, Philippines. So we actually started a new innovative concept of remote QP audits where literally our guys were sitting for 8 hours over a teleconference. We had to set up technology that we had to do a remote QP audit of the facility while their representatives, the GMP representatives, were sitting out there, and our representatives were sitting and asking all the questions. They had done night shifts just to make sure that the patient doesn't lose the drug. The patient gets the drug on time so that we can do the audits and we can do the QP release accordingly, right? So there's this. These are the kind of things that we implemented. The ability for us to deliver the drugs directly from our depots to the patient's home. That's another challenge that we came across with. The flights were shut down. The trade compliance, the cross-border customs compliance became a huge challenge. Many countries started putting restrictions on the availability of the PPE material to IPs also. Many countries started controlling the drugs that could be shipped out and in, right? So dealing all of that on a day-to-day basis, on a 24/7 basis with the regulators and informing them that why is it important for us to drive this is something which we have been able to mitigate it. Another great example, we had a situation of a cancer drug patient who was based in Malaysia, and our depot was in Singapore, and because of the lockdown, the person used to travel over the weekend for the therapy, right? Over Malaysia to Singapore is a cross border, but because of the lockdown, the travels were stopped, and we had to literally work with the regulator to get a protocol deviation done so that we could take that therapy, that drug from our depot to the patient's home in Malaysia so that he does not lose the. So these are the kind of, I would rather say these challenges have actually opened up avenues. These challenges have opened up new opportunities and new way of thinking for regulators, for sponsors, for CROs to start looking at different. That's how we have looked at it. We have looked at it as a more positive opportunities for us to implement technologies that probably previously we were not able to do it, right? From whether it was a risk-based monitoring or a remote monitoring piece of it, or whether it is trying to rely on real-world evidence and trying to drive a synthetic arm control. This is all has come out because of the pandemic. The pandemic has driven this challenge. Now, having said that, yes, the pandemic equally, as you said, Sujata, for all of us, it has been a little overwhelming with the wave two, because with the wave one, I believe the day when the wave one happened, I still remember the March first week when this got announced and the lockdown happened. Believe it or not, within 1 week's time, we got our 5,600 employees working from home the next day. We still had 250 people without laptops. We arranged that in 2 weeks' time. And since then, all our 5,600 people have been working from home due diligently, making sure that they are in a safe working environment. We made sure that we are providing them all opportunities, like right from IT equipments to tables, chairs, whatever that we could provide to make them comfortable, to internet connectivity, so that they don't have to worry about coming to the office. Like suddenly imagine the 5,600 people who were coming in 4 shifts in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chandigarh, Mohali, suddenly we're now all working from home. And the good part was not a single drop in productivity happened. We gave a productivity better than what we were technically giving in that environment. And that's the thing that we brought in place for employees. Now with the wave two, of course, the challenge continues to happen. But recently, we're doing everything possible from ourselves, from a social responsibility perspective as well. So we worked with Indian Institute of Science recently to launch a mobile lab testing van, RT-PCR van that we created. So technically, it's a mobile van that allows you to go around anywhere, cross to cross border state. In fact, the van was deployed in the Kumbh Mela as well. And that's the kind of investments that we're doing from a corporate social responsibility. We have also invested recently on a vaccine van now, which is being launched in next week's time, so that this will become a mobile vaccine for the vaccines to be launched. We're working with the state government to do that. In addition to that, we recently have ordered for 100 plus oxygen concentrators by spending around 75 lakhs. That will be distributed to the states in need, so including Karnataka, Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad. We're working with the states so that those oxygen concentrators could be given and could be deployed. So that has already happened. In fact, we just mentioned that on LinkedIn just last week itself, that we've been successfully been able to do that. So those are some of the things that our employees are doing from a social responsibility perspective. But to take care of our employees, we have also put together a 24/7 COVID response task force now. So the people who are impacted, like we do have a few positive tests that have been impacted. We are making sure that by 24/7, this COVID response task force is helping them with things like organizing, working with the state governments to see the hospital beds, the oxygen concentrators, the oxygen cylinder availability, even medications to the extent, last week we had a requirement of a plasma. We even went to the extent of getting a plasma donor for some of our employees, not just the employees, but even to their akins as well. And last but not the least, but we are also now implementing a vaccine campaign for our employees, which Parexel is initiating as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing for our people to deal with this pandemic at this point of time, while standing together with India in this fight together by helping the society, but at the same time, working with our people as well to make sure that whatever we can do on the table that we can bring. Now, the last question, wave three. I think what we have implemented as a lessons learned from wave one and wave two, I think this is exactly what we're going to replicate and move forward. I think our biggest push would be to get 100% of our employees vaccinated, because I think the only way, honestly, for Sujata, that this pandemic chain could be broken is to make sure that 100% of India's population gets vaccinated as soon as possible. Because see, the intent of vaccine is not to protect you from the disease, but what it does is ultimately it protects you from the vulnerability of reaching to a stage of hospitalization. And that is critical. That is critical for us to make sure that our citizens get vaccinated with top priority. And whether it is the citizens of India or the citizens of Parexel, I think that would be our top priority at this point of time to tackle the wave three. So.
Okay, I wasn't talking about wave three. Wave three is imminent, and I think we will be hopefully learning lessons from wave two. But I was talking about a different kind of pandemic. If it hit, how are we prepared? Is the world prepared for that?
A completely different pandemic outside of COVID, are you saying? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, as I said, I said in the previous thing, because of COVID, I think the whole focus on immunomodulatory therapies has become suddenly a big priority across all the sponsors and governments. Like if you really see the shift that has happened in the number of clinical trial applications that have come up, not just for COVID therapies, but generally around immunomodulatory therapies, which is what is focusing towards the new pandemic, right? That has suddenly become a very top focus. I have like personally at Parexel also, we have seen a lot of those clinical new CTAs that are coming up, clinical trial applications. They're all focused around either immuno-oncology, modulatory therapies, and all that stuff. So I do see that the industry has already started shifting towards that, and I think the governments are also have started focusing on what could be the next pandemic that could come up and how soon can we be prepared. Now with these new technologies as mRNA and other stuff, I think it has given a very strong confidence to people that even now a new pandemic comes in, I think our ability to get a vaccine on the table would be much faster than as compared to what it was. Like we don't have to go through the whole life cycle. As you said, I hope that the industry has learned really good lessons. I hope the industry will take the best practices, what they implemented, the technologies like mRNA and other stuff, the synthetic control arms and other stuff, and we will be able to enhance and replicate this if and another pandemic hits in as we proceed. So I think I'm an eternal optimist, Sujata, unfortunately or fortunately, you can call me that. But I do believe that all this and the hash no looking back, I believe is probably going to open more avenues and more faster therapies into the market. So
yeah, that's one thing that has happened during COVID. That alliances between the global pharma companies and the research organizations. So How do you see the strategic alliances between CROs and the pharma companies, the big pharma companies happening?
I think it will continue to enhance. Now, I don't know if you're talking about strategic alliances turning into mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships of those sort, but I believe a lot more dialogue is happening. Traditionally, this industry has been very risk averse in terms of sharing information and knowledge, right? We have seen that change. Like great examples, Pfizer, BioNTech coming together, right? Moderna and all that stuff. And there are many of the small biotech companies and big pharma companies have come together, joined hands, and have joined their resources and their knowledge together to bring therapy. I believe that is going to happen. A lot of consolidation is already happening within the sponsor industry, but also in the clinical industry as well. So there won't be more surprises around there. I think stronger partnerships will evolve. Stronger partnerships in a vested mode will involve, where both the CROs and sponsors would want to put their skin in the game and work towards a common goal of bringing these therapies into the market with new areas like cell and gene therapies, with new areas like precision medicine. I think it's all the more becoming important for both the sponsor pharma companies and the clinical research organizations to come together and start working in a more vested partnership than in a siloed manner. So I believe that it's just going to go up and positive as we move on. So
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you for your time.